Hello, welcome to New Scientist Weekly, where we discuss the most fascinating science news of the week. I'm Rowan Hooper.
And I'm Penny Sarche.
Penny, I'm thinking we might need a content warning for this episode.
I think you might be right. This is science-friendly, scientific, but it is quite adult themes.
It is. There's going to be a lot of sex on this episode, so take that as the content warning.
Mostly chimps and bonobos, we should say.
Yeah, mostly chimps and bonobos, but we are going to be looking at humans as well. So the bulk of it is going to be looking at how chimps and bonobos, that are closest relatives, how they manage their social relationships and what that means for humans. And it does have these very interesting implications for what it means for that when you start thinking about sexuality and sex in non-human primates.
Yeah, really fascinating. And we're also going to be looking at tool use in ancient humans, and we'll be discussing a new American idea to grow giant structures in space. That's grow, not build. But first, it's chimps and bonobos, and you may be familiar with this sort of classic textbook view of these close relatives of ours. Chimps are these patriarchal, aggressive, physically violent, warring animals. And then bonobos are sort of matriarchal, hippie, free love. That's the kind of stereotype contrast, right? And the bonobos, they famously use sexual interactions to manage disputes and maintain their sort of happy group structure. So that's the classic view. But according to a new study out this week, it's not quite as tidy as all that. Surprise!
We would have thought it, yeah. Yeah, animal behaviour, not quite so tidy as we thought. So these are from observations of behaviour of bonobos at the Lola ya Bonobo Sanctuary in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and chimps at the Chimfunchi Wildlife Orphanage Trust in Zambia. And even though these are sanctuaries where food is provided, you still get this very much a social structure around dinner time.
A bit like the canteen in the office, then.
Just like that.
Well, fortunately, the similarities do sort of end there, because what the researchers found is that there were lots of instances of genital contact, so that's animals touching each other's genitals before feeding events. That was 107 observations in the bonobos and 201 in the chimps.
Yeah, I did notice in the paper it says that apes use genital contact before eating where they might be competing for food. So it says they either put a hand or a foot onto another primate's anogenital region, or it might also involve the genitals touching each other.
Right.
So that is, as far as my experience in the canteen downstairs, that is the difference to that. So I asked the lead author of this work to tell us about it. This is Jake Brooker of Durham University, and here's what he said.
Bonobos are quite famous for using sex after conflicts. It's one of the things that they are most known for, and it's possibly used as a way to repair social bonds. Both bonobos and chimps use a lot of different behaviors to reassure one another after conflicts or to reduce tension during competition. But we wanted to see if this focus on sexuality during periods of social tension is really a key difference between these two species. We found that bonobos do indeed use sex after fights more than chimpanzees, but chimps still used it a lot. And actually, during general periods of elevated social tension, where feeding competition is expected, we found a massive overlap between the two species in their tendencies to use genital contacts in these moments. And what's more, in both contexts and in both species, all hetero and homosexual combinations use sexual behavior, some more so than others, but it was notably consistent as a possible strategy in all of them. This tells us that sexual behavior as a social tool is not unique to bonobos or to us, and it raises interesting questions about how far back this trait goes in our own evolutionary history.
So that's interesting then. It starts to break down some of these kind of differences and the ideas of how different these two species are, right?
Yeah.
Now, we have with us this week Sophie Bergudo. She's recently finished a PhD on chimp behaviour. And Sophie, you were looking at a group of wild chimps in Bossou in Guinea, West Africa. What are your thoughts then on this kind of chimp sexual behaviour?
Yeah, so one of the questions that really comes out of this study is whether the same applies to wild populations. As Rowan, you said, this was a sanctuary setting. And I've spent the past 4 years getting to know the Bossou chimps very well. And I've watched their behaviour over a 25-year period. And I can confirm that the wild chimps there use sex a lot to calm down after stressful situations. So I saw many cases of the males standing off against each other and then mounting each other at the end of the interaction. And that's something else that this research found that Jake also mentioned, is that the frequency of the sex in these competitive situations were more common among males in the chimps and more common in the females in the bonobos. And in the Bossou chimps, I definitely saw a really similar pattern. In fact, the whole time that I observed the current alpha male of the group, it's a lovely chimp called JJ, I only saw him ever have sex with other males.
So they might have a bit of a put up, stand off against another male, but then go, we'll just mount each other and make up.
It seems to be that they're just trying to relieve their stress after a bit of tension.
Interesting.
That is interesting. And I think people often point to primate species for perhaps examples of like homosexuality not just being a human phenomenon. That's very well established now. But it does also remind me a bit of, say, Roman society, where you've got, or we used to have apparently, older, maybe higher class males would have sexual relationships with younger, lower class males, and it's all sort of wrapped up in power dynamics and social status rather than whether someone's heterosexual or homosexual. Is that a sort of fair comparison to make?
Well, I don't know if there's ever been any actual research on this in Bossou itself, but anecdotally, I watched JJ, so this alpha male, and he's still currently the alpha male of the group. So I watched him during a 3-month period every year from when he was born to being 20, and I never saw him copulate with a female.
What, not for want of trying, but he just didn't have any interest?
I never saw him even try.
Right.
Yeah. So sex between males is known in at least 51 different primate species. So, for example, a 2023 study on rhesus macaques in Puerto Rico found that almost 3/4 of males have sex with other males. So it'd be really interesting to see how the power dynamics play a role in that.
And so then to go back to this new work then showing that chimps use sex as a way to sort of relieve tensions non-reproductively, is there anything that tells us about us? I mean, thankfully we don't all solve all of our arguments this way, but similarly we don't only use sex for reproduction. Does this tell us anything about how that evolved or the role of sex in human society?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jake mentioned that as well, and they talk about that in their paper. So since sex is found to be used as a stress relief in humans, chimps and bonobos, and we're obviously all very closely evolutionarily related to each other, this does lend support to the idea that the behaviour is far deeper in an evolutionary history than we may have thought. So our common ancestor between ourselves and chimpanzees and bonobos lived around 8 million years ago, and it seems likely that they also would have had sex as part of their social interactions, not just for reproduction.
Yeah, I can easily buy that.
Plausible, yeah.
And I asked Jake Brooker a bit more about this variation in sex and aggression across those 3 species, humans, bonobos and chimps. And here he is again.
Bonobos are not as well known as chimpanzees, but if people do know them, then they are often regarded as these peaceful, hypersexual hippies, and chimps are these competitive, vicious beasts. When this was the prevailing view, it was thought that perhaps chimps lived in patchier environments that fostered greater competition, whilst bonobos lived in these dense forests with high food abundance, which allowed for greater affiliation between the social borders. But our new study contributes to a growing body of literature indicating that these Jekyll and Hyde-like personality caricatures are really oversimplified. It's true that chimps and bonobos, for that matter, can be very competitive and very aggressive, but their capacity and predisposition for cooperation is exceptional. It seems that in terms of sociality, social tolerance, and maybe even some aspects of their aggression, bonobos and chimps really do not vary as much between species as they do in fact between individuals and groups within their own species. They do differ in hierarchical structures, whereby chimp groups are male bonded and bonobo groups are female bonded. The jury is out regarding exactly why this is the case, and there are some interesting hypotheses in this area, but what I find the most fascinating about these apes is that, like us, bonobos and chimps show a tremendous amount of behavioral flexibility, indicating that this may have been one of the most defining features of our last common ancestor. No matter what caused bonobos and chimps to take their own evolutionary paths, to understand the origins of our own behavior, it is really paramount that we learn more about both of these species.
I was really struck there about thinking about the assumptions we make about what different species do and the assumptions that we've had about bonobos and chimps over the years. and then actually, well, why don't we go and do some observations and look at this more systematically? And then turns out, though, those assumptions were wrong. And you see it, you think about what we used to assume about Neanderthals, say, and in so many aspects of science that's the case.
Well,
isn't
equally, if I guess aliens were observing us, would we come across as really loving and caring and chilled out, or hyper violent and aggressive? Like, we're both, right? And we've projected these two different things onto these two different relatives. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And Sophie, your observations of wild chimps using sex to manage their stress, that wasn't actually what you were studying for your PhD, was it? And you were looking at, so they've got this unique way of using of stone tools, haven't they? Where they use an anvil, one stone as an anvil and another as a hammer to crack nuts. We've got a clip of it, and the bashing you're going to hear here is the chimps smashing the nuts open. So tell us a bit more about what's going on there with the nut cracking.
Well, that was really the sound of my PhD. That's a very familiar one for me. So the Bossou chimpanzees are one of only a handful of chimp communities in West Africa that are known to crack nuts. And they're the only ones, as you say, Rowan, who use these two stones in combination to crack open the nuts. And this behaviour has garnered loads of attention over the years because it shares similarities with the early Olduvai technology. So this was used by hominins around 2.6 million years ago. And we know that Olduvai tools were actually used in lots of different ways, but a very common way that seems to be found across sites is that they're used to pound open hard to access resources like bone to access the marrow or nuts to access the kernel. So my research was looking at that behaviour in the Bossou chimpanzees, specifically how they learn to use these tools, which they do over a really long time period. So it takes them 5 years to acquire this skill.
Wow.
And they do this by, it's very sweet to watch, by them peering really closely at more knowledgeable individuals performing the skill.
Come here, youngling, watch how I crack this nut. It reminds me of a podcast we did a little while ago about why chimps are stuck in the Stone Age. And we'll put a link to that on the show notes. What's another thing that's amazing about this particular nut cracking behaviour in West African chimps is that it's got this UN designated status, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think this is something that people don't really know about, is the fact that the UN is starting to protect animal cultures. So, as you say, this West African nutcracking tradition is protected under the United Nations Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, for being vital for the conservation of the West African chimpanzee subspecies, which perhaps unsurprisingly is critically endangered. But unfortunately, the Bossou community is on the brink of extinction now. So during the course of just my PhD, 5 chimps either died or disappeared. Wow. And in fact, when researchers went there just last year, they found that there were only 3 chimps remaining. So 2 males and an elderly female. So we're at risk of losing this unique chimpanzee cultural behaviour.
I only worked on insects, and I actually remember being quite moved when one of my study insects in the wild died and I saw either its dead body or it didn't turn up the next day. And that was just a dragonfly. Like, it must be quite moving if you see one of your animals, not come back. And it's a chimp, that's even more so.
It's really devastating. Yeah. And we know these chimpanzees so well now. They've been studied systematically for many, many years, and it's always heartbreaking when we lose one.
Would it be possible to sort of move chimps elsewhere, from elsewhere in West Africa to Bossou, and sort of plump up the community there and save it? I wondered about this. So we asked primatologist Katerina Almeida Warren from the University of Oxford. She's going to Bossou next week. And here's what she said.
For some species, reintroductions can be a great way of boosting population numbers. However, when we're talking about chimpanzees, things get a bit more complicated because these communities have such complex social structures and social environments. So sometimes it's quite hard to predict how new individuals will be received by the communities they're being introduced to. Now, the case of Bossou is particularly complex because aside from needing quite a large influx of individuals to make the population sustainable in the long term, the other thing we need to contend with is that the Bossou community is super habituated to human presence, and it's rare for a day to go by without crossing paths with someone. And there's really not any other place where Western chimpanzees have had similar experiences to draw these individuals from. It is incredibly sad to think that these may be the final cries or pant hoots, if you will, of this infamous chimpanzee community. But I do feel that the Bossou story can be used as a force for good by helping to shape future conservation efforts to protect other endangered chimpanzee communities and their cultural heritage.
The last pant hoot from the community is really sad, isn't it? And on top of that, I saw there was funding from USAID and the US Forestry Service to help reforest parts of the Bossou area. And now, of course, the status of that funding is unclear as the results of all the cuts that are going through with the Trump administration. So, and on the conflict between humans and chimps in Bossou and the complexities of that, along with climate change, here's something else that Katerina had to say.
For the local human community, the Manon, their cultural tradition is to see chimpanzees as their ancestors. And in fact, many elders recall themselves or their parents leaving food offerings outside their plantations for the chimpanzees to eat. Now, understanding what has changed in Bossou over the years and why there has been increasing tensions between humans and chimpanzees is really complicated to unpack in such a short period of time. There are so many layers to it, but there's one thing that I think is incredibly important to consider, which is the political and socioeconomic context of what's going on. The Bossou people have had to deal with a number of challenges over the last decades, including Ebola, but also several military coups and changes in government. So as a result of that and other factors, job security remains low, and many people turn to subsistence farming to support their families and their communities. And as the population increases, there's less land available. But something that has been happening increasingly in the last years is the effect of climate change. For example, it's affecting the crops that people are growing, but it's also affecting food prices. So when they need to resort to alternative food sources, they also don't necessarily have the money to pay for them. So increasingly, when someone sees a chimpanzee, for example, taking a pineapple from their field, this becomes a point of conflict.
All this talk of stone tools brings us onto another story published this week, and this is evidence that ancient humans were making tools out of animal bones 1.5 million years ago, and that's over 1 million years earlier than previously thought.
Yeah. So in the archaeological record, it shows that we were making stone tools, about 2.6 million years ago at least. But we thought that we only consistently started making these bone tools about 400,000 years ago. Sophie, is it as obvious as bone is less durable than stone, and so it's harder for archaeologists to snuff all that stuff up?
That's definitely one of the reasons why paleoanthropologists may not be uncovering as many bone tools. Bones are at high risk of being trampled, destroyed, and there's also a really high bar if you find a bone to say that this was used as a tool, because unless it's been crafted in a particular way to have a certain function, it's hard to tell if the marks that are left behind on the bone were caused by humans or other animals, or just weathering that's occurred over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years.
So that's why this new study is exciting, because the bones were definitely used as tools. Right. The study is at the iconic Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, famous for the discovery of lots of early humans and tools that have really shed so much light on human evolution. And in this case, the researchers over 5 years were excavating the area, and they uncovered 22,000 bits of bone, and 27 of those are definitely tools. And that's in a layer that was dated to 1.5 million years ago. The tools, they come from elephants, hippos, bovids, their bones, and they've been carefully shaped with sharp edges to make them useful for cutting.
And so who made these tools 1.5 million years ago?
So, I mean, the first thing you do is look for evidence, right? But no hominin bones have been identified at the site. So we can't be confident who made them. It could have been Homo erectus. It could possibly have been Homo habilis, an earlier species. Both are thought to be our ancestors, or at least close relatives of our ancestors. But it could even be an earlier hominin called Paranthropus.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it were Paranthropus. We do have evidence of them using bones to dig into termite mounds in South Africa up to 1.8 million years ago. But these bones were just used to get access to the mounds, and they haven't been purposefully modified in the same ways like the ones that have just been discovered were.
So the big mystery is this incredible gap between these newly discovered bone tools dated to 1.5 million years ago and the next reliably identified sets of bone tools that we already knew about, which are over 1 million years later. It's a long time.
It is. So how do they explain that gap away?
So one suggestion is that around the same time, hominins were starting to make a new type of stone tool called a Acheulean. So bone tools like those found at Olduvai may not have been as good at cutting as this new Acheulean technology stone tool. So maybe people just stopped making them.
So the tech got outdated and then it got picked up again 1 million years later.
Yeah, and then maybe by then they had different purposes for using them. The other possibility is that maybe ancient humans were using bone tools the whole time, but most of them have been lost because bone just doesn't preserve as easily as we said earlier.
Yeah, and it may turn out that first idea is true, but the issue of preservation will definitely be at least part of the story. There's a real issue when it comes to understanding how tech-savvy our early human ancestors were, and the archaeological record is completely biased towards stones because stones don't perish like plants and bones do. This bias is something I covered in a story in November, with the idea that implements made from organic materials like plants, skins and bones make up the missing majority of artefacts.
Yeah, that's a great piece. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. So are there ways that we can find these implements that, may not be as obviously used by humans as this new stuff?
There is, and I actually think it's a really exciting area of research. That's definitely the space to watch going forward because these new techniques keep discovering new artefacts. And these are artefacts that we would never have thought possible to discover. Something I'm personally very excited by is the ongoing research looking for early wooden pounding tools that were used by hominins. So by comparing the damage found on pieces of fossilized wood with the damage left behind on wooden hammers used by modern-day chimps, we can try and find those articles.
Right.
So we're still waiting to hear on the results of that study. But when I spoke to a member of the team about it, she was really hopeful that they'd be able to identify some of these very early wooden tools. And if they do find it, that would push back the date for the earliest plant-based tech by 250,000 years.
Wow, amazing.
Lastly, we turn to another example of primate tool construction, albeit quite hypothetical, this one. This is the US military looking into growing giant biological structures in space.
Yeah, I see
can't even get to the end of the sentence without laughing.
So this is the news that DARPA, and that's the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, scientists there are exploring ways to, as you say, grow biological structures in space. And they suggest you could perhaps grow a massive telescope antenna or a gigantic biological net to catch space debris. And DARPA says that you could perhaps grow these biomechanical structures 0.5 kilometre long. You could use them to make new modules for a space station, or even, they say, space elevators connecting Earth's surface.
Well, you were writing about the possibility of space elevators most recently.
I was in my column, and I did find quite a bit of work on it. And it turns out that the engineering challenge to build an elevator from Earth's surface into orbit, that is just not going to happen ever. The challenges are far too great. But actually, it's surprisingly feasible to make an elevator from the lunar surface into orbit. The tech is actually here now. If we had the political will and the money, you could feasibly build a lunar space elevator.
So you'd fly to the moon and then you could hop on the elevator somewhere else?
Yeah, well, you'd fly to an orbiting platform around the moon, and then you'd use the elevator to get up and down and ferry stuff around.
Yeah. But when we talk about space elevators, I guess we've been talking about the challenges of finding the materials that can do it. It hadn't even occurred to me that we might be looking at living things that have to somehow be exposed to cosmic rays and the low temperatures of space. This sounds really hard.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing that really puzzles me, to put it politely, about the DARPA project. How are they going to grow things biologically that can then withstand space? And I had a look at what they're doing, and I found something called the BSHORE program. That stands for Biomanufacturing, Survival, Utility and Reliability Beyond Earth.
Beyond Earth. That sounds familiar.
Does sound like something Elon Musk would get behind. Even for DARPA, which is famous for speculating about and really putting money behind real blue sky stuff. This is quite out there, I think. And
literally.
There's something else called the NOMAD program that I found. That stands for Novel Orbital and Moon Manufacturing Materials and Mass Efficient Design. That's NOM4D, and they pronounce it NOMAD. That's all about getting raw materials from Earth up into space for in-orbit manufacturing. And what they're saying now is that you can combine NOMAD and BSHORE and get to this and get biological manufacturing in orbit.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if anything comes of it. There's a meeting in April at DARPA to decide whether they pursue this further, so we'll have to see.
We will. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks to our guest, Sophie Bergudo. Thanks to you for listening.
Do tell your friends about us, give us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to us on YouTube. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.